If I'm known for anything, well, I mean, besides talking about all my ancestors who were in famous historical events and uh, posting pictures of my son playing soccer on Instagram, um, or just saying things right before they happen in a video. If I'm known for anything besides all those other things, it's my admiration and love for the man, the myth, the legend, Thomas Woodrow Wilson. Now, in all seriousness, if you've been around the channel very long at all, you know I hate his guts. I hate him enough that hate's a strong word. I never met the man. He's my least favorite president. But so much so that I now have a t-shirt available on the merch store that says "Suck It, Wilson." But a lot of people have been recommending this video to me. It's by Monsieur Z, whose channel I've never done a reaction to, nor have I ever seen any of his videos. But this one is called Woodrow Wilson Did Nothing Wrong. And I'm pretty sure that he's serious about this. I don't think this is like my April Fool's Day video that I did talking about Woodrow Wilson being my favorite president, which I will throw up a link at the end if you want to check that out. But no, it seems like he's very, very serious about this. And I'm just going to read some of the comments. Well, here, let me kind of move things around here so you can check those out too. So let's see. I don't agree at all that he did nothing wrong, but I do agree that he is unfairly represented today. Saying he did nothing wrong is a bit much, but I'll agree he isn't as bad as sometimes made out to be. Can't judge actions of a person on the standards today. It's unfair, will only lead to a cynical look at history. I do agree that we shouldn't judge people on today's standards, but I judge Woodrow Wilson on Woodrow Wilson's day's standards, and he still comes up pretty bad. So, all right, without further ado, let's go ahead and dive into this one and see what it's all about.
American President Woodrow Wilson. Historically has been regarded highly, though in recent times has been shot down and relegated to the bottom of the barrel, and seemingly...
I don't know that in recent times he's relegated to the bottom of the barrel, but he is dropping a little lower. He's been consistently top 10 throughout history in terms of historical rankings, but he seems to be kind of more 10 to 20 range now, but he's far from the bottom.
From across the political spectrum as well. Republicans, Democrats, Libertarians, Greens, Liberals, and Conservatives increasingly appear to carry a negative opinion of Wilson for any number of individual or combination of reasons. While Wilson has suffered these blows to his reputation, almost paradoxically has another president from the same era risen to tremendous popularity in spite of many of the same, if not more extreme, actions and ideological leanings. That president was the much-beloved Theodore Roosevelt and will be...
Did he just say that Theodore Roosevelt was more extreme ideologically? Okay, I mean, I guess if you're looking at how Theodore Roosevelt was breaking from the norm for his party, that's probably true. But I think, well, again, if we're looking at it from today's perspective, Theodore Roosevelt wasn't extreme at all. But I know why it's dangerous to do that.
Referencing him and the progressive movement of the day repeatedly throughout this video. Most often pinned on Wilson are accusations of tyranny, racism, imperialism, hypocrisy, incompetence, warmongering, etc. Great hate seems to stem from a belief that he was particularly responsible for actions which in reality were the product of years of progressive policy, from a belief that he somehow altered or compromised the progressive movement, from a belief that he stood widely apart from other progressives of the day, and alone must shoulder the scorn for all which might have gone wrong during those decades. Moreover, that so much wrong occurred during those days, when in fact we find great justification and acceptance from the public of the time in regard to actions taken by the Wilson administration.
Alright, first thing I need to say is I apologize in advance if you have a little trouble understanding him. It seems like I don't know if he's just talking fast or he's not enunciating real well, but and granted, I'm partially deaf in my right ear, so sometimes if I can't read people's lips, I have a little trouble understanding what they're saying, but I am having a bit of trouble understanding what he's saying, and I don't think turning on the captions is going to help with him.
Of course, I'll preface this and later conclude as well by stating that I do not personally agree with all of the policies and ideologies of Woodrow Wilson, but rather recognize a very unjust mischaracterization of a historic figure and feel it only right to correct such misunderstanding through insight. Wilson has been accused of taking the use of government power to unprecedented and unjustified heights in his creation of new business regulations, establishing the income tax, establishing the Federal Reserve, and prosecuting anti-American and extremist individuals during and immediately following the American entry into the Great War.
Alright, so I'll say up front, if he's gonna go down the route of, well, other people did that stuff, that's not a defense, right? So if you're gonna say, well, John Adams signed the Alien and Sedition Act, true, but that also really sucked, and John Adams should be loudly condemned for that, as he is. You know, if we're gonna go down the route of looking at some of the stuff that Abraham Lincoln did when he was dealing with a civil war, that one I don't know if I would compare to exactly, but as far as the income tax goes, yes, Theodore Roosevelt was also in favor of that. That's why you don't typically hear me talk too much about the income tax and some of those policies of Wilson's, because those things were going to happen whether Wilson was president or not.
On regulation, Wilson's Federal Trade Commission was a more efficient successor to Roosevelt's Bureau of Corporations, which could not regulate but only investigate and bring such findings before a court, allowing unscrupulous businesses to navigate loopholes during this long process. Wilson's FTC, on the other hand, could now investigate and act immediately, bringing a rapid end to illegal and unfair practices, as well as prevent the formation of monopolies and trusts before they had a chance to establish themselves, by giving the government direct oversight and final say whenever large businesses decided to merge. On taxation, Wilson merely built upon the work and infrastructure of his predecessors, Roosevelt and Taft, by putting the previously established 16th Amendment, which authorized Congress to collect taxes on income, to work. Wilson's tax was a mere 1 to 6% for only the top 3% of the population. The revenue accumulated from this tax allowing Wilson to cut tariffs by nearly half and thus significantly reduce the price of imported products for the entire country.
So, I guess it depends entirely on your view of taxes and tariffs. Now, was the income tax super low and only applied to a few people? Sure, but that's where it started. So, if you look at the tax situation as it is today, first of all, if we went back to the 18th century and told the founding fathers what our tax rates were like today, they would just lose their minds, because look at what they rebelled over as far as taxes go. And of course, granted, it was about representation too, but so I feel like he's defending. I get it. Some people do criticize Wilson for some of this stuff, but this isn't the stuff I have an issue with Woodrow Wilson over.
On the Federal Reserve, it must be stressed that Wilson inherited the Federal Reserve Plan from a commission originally established during the Roosevelt administration, which sought to create a centralized banking system now that the US had gone from a regional and developing power to a global power. Wilson not wanting to establish a central bank per se, given the country's bumpy history with such systems.
I was going to say, we had central banks going all the way back to the beginning of the country, National Bank, and that was something that was debated over in many of the early administrations. Nothing new there.
Modify the plan by introducing elements which turned it into a semi-private, semi-public institution. However, its function remained largely the same as was intended by the Commission, and the new plan was largely praised by progressives of the day, who saw it as a solution to America's economic instability. Whether it was successful is extremely questionable, and what Wilson can be faulted for if truly the Reserve is a faulty system is merely that he happened to be the man to sign it into existence. Had Roosevelt, Taft, or any other progressive of the day been in his position, it almost certainly would have been created regardless.
I think that's a fair. I feel dirty just like even implying that I'm defending Wilson. But again, this isn't the stuff I have issue with, because I agree 100%. I don't know about Taft, but I think Roosevelt certainly would have supported this, so no surprise there.
On the Espionage and Sedition Acts, America had faced internal strife for some time by the presidency of Wilson, primarily actions perpetrated by recent immigrants who subscribed to anarchist and socialist ideologies from Europe and engaged in violent action against American citizens. With the outbreak of the Great War,
you show William McKinley being assassinated by an anarchist, but that guy wasn't an immigrant, so we're not talking about an immigrant anarchist in that case. Leon Czolgosz was an American. He was born in America. The idea that, just Wilson did this stuff, but America had been dealing with internal strife for a while, does not excuse it.
There's abounded of foreign actors attempting to harm or provoke the United States. The British were eager to have the United States on their side and may not have been above putting American lives in danger to accomplish that goal. Meanwhile, the Germans were more interested in causing trouble that would keep the United States preoccupied and out of Europe, perhaps inciting a large population of German Americans into rebellion, or provoking Mexico to initiate a war with its northern neighbor.
Wait, is he arguing that because the United States had a lot of German immigrants that Wilson had the right and the responsibility to sign these acts. I mean, that's basically, in my mind anyway, the same argument as saying, well, Japanese Americans during World War II could have been a real problem, so FDR had every right to put them in camps. That sounds like what he's saying here.
Wilson was not willing to accept this risk, and until threats subsided, sought to cracking down on seditious speech, and roughly 1,000 individuals were prosecuted. Following the end of the Great War and as the Russian Civil War raged on, inspiring far-left activities across Europe, a series of anarchist-inspired bombings and assassination attempts on prominent Americans were made, provoking a surge of arrests in an attempt to quell what many feared could be an anarchist or communist uprising within the US.
There were people doing bad stuff, so all the bad stuff Wilson did was justified. That's what I'm hearing right now.
The morality of these actions are not purely black and white. They were desperate.
No, they're pretty black and white. They were wrong. You don't start rounding people up and throwing away their civil liberties because somebody bombed a building and there's a threat of anarchy and there's a threat of communism. That does not give you the right to throw the Constitution out the window.
Actions during desperate times, not unfamiliar to American policy whenever it finds itself drawn into foreign affairs. One of the earliest laws passed in this country, after all, having been the Alien and Sedition Acts, meant to serve much of the same purpose when war with France was a strong possibility.
And it was also abhorrent and should never have been passed. And I think people agree on that.
To wholly dismiss the circumstances surrounding Wilson's reasoning for resorting to this decision and then moralizing it as merely bad is plainly unjust. In summary, Wilson's use of government power was not without justification nor precedent, nor was it out of line with progressive governing strategies used by his predecessors Taft and Roosevelt. As was expected of a progressive, Wilson utilized federal power to produce efficiency, security, and greater prosperity for the majority, even if at the expense of a wealthy, deviant, or criminal minority.
Nothing wrong with doing... by the way, I love where I paused right there. That's beautiful, with the big black band in the middle. Nothing wrong with doing something that's good for the majority of the people at the expense of a wealthy or criminal minority. The whole basis of this country was founded on the idea that we don't want to have the tyranny of the majority. That's why we're not a pure democracy. It's why we're a constitutional federal republic.
Wilson has been accused of intensifying segregation in government, giving rise to the Second Ku Klux Klan, and
those aren't accusations. That's black and white fact. All right, let's hear what he has to say.
As many like to say, being racist even for his time. On the matter of government segregation, the exclusion or disfavor of black employees, what was known as the Lily White movement, was by and large a product of its day, and more so of progressivism in particular. I
love how he's showing a picture of Republicans as he talks about the racism of Democrat Woodrow Wilson. Now, I'm not here to argue Republican, Democrat, party stances back then versus now, any of that stuff. I'm just saying it's just a real misleading photo to put when you're talking about Woodrow Wilson.
By and large a product of its day, and more so of progressivism in particular. I touch on this in great detail in this video here, but to summarize, progressivism of the day was obsessed with efficiency and purity. As the belief of many went, you could not have an efficient society or system if there were deviant factors which refused to assimilate and act in harmony with the rest.
So are we arguing that to be black was to be a deviant section of society? Is that what he's saying here? All right, let me not get ahead of myself.
Blacks were commonly seen as less American than most immigrants, said immigrants being largely white and thus able to blend more seamlessly into the American culture over time. Racial tensions at the time were very high, especially as many blacks began moving in great number from the south to the north, and progressive politicians responded to this by ostracizing blacks from their ranks. Following a much criticized dinner with Booker T. Washington, Roosevelt caved to public desires and embraced the Lily White movement. Taft did the same, and Wilson, also being a progressive, followed suit.
But did Roosevelt or Taft put into place regulations that made it impossible for black people to get jobs in the federal government? That made a situation where blacks and whites couldn't work side by side, where one dude who couldn't quit his job and couldn't be assigned somewhere else actually had a cage built around him in his office so he could continue working there? Did those guys do those things?
While Wilson allowed lily-whiteism to continue, once again we have an instance of if virtually any other progressive was in power instead of him, it would have happened anyway, and these actions are a product of the progressive culture of the time.
Absolutely freaking not. Don't even accuse people like Roosevelt as being the same on Woodrow Wilson when it comes to race relations. Not even close.
Not a product of Wilson being, quote, racist even for his time. One might even argue that Wilson did more for blacks than other progressives in that he took a clear and vocal position against lynching, demanding state governors take action to end...
Did he just say he did more for blacks than other progressives because he stood up against lynching? Wait, I need to hear that again because I don't want to be mistaken that he actually said that.
Other progressives in that he racist even for his instance of if virtually any other progressive was in power instead of him, it would have happened anyway, and these actions are a product of the progressive culture of the time, not a product of Wilson being, quote, racist even for his time. One might even argue that Wilson did more for blacks than other progressives in that he took a clear and vocal position against lynching, demanding state governors take action to end what he called a disgraceful evil.
I need some, this'll work. This'll have to do. Okay, let's go on.
On the matter of the Second Ku Klux Klan, it is argued that Wilson gave legitimacy to the movement by hosting a screening of The Birth of a Nation at the White House.
Do you think?
The movie, by the time of its creation, had already been a widely popular novel and play by the name of The Klansman.
So now the defense is he screened a Klan movie at the White House, but it was popular by the time he did that. So what's the big deal? I just needed a minute there. Let's continue.
Despite its controversial portrayal of the first Ku Klux Klan in its final acts, the film was still hailed for pioneering a number of cinematic innovations, which brought it great attention. Wilson had known the writer of the original novel that the film was based on, Thomas Dixon, as a university peer, and he was indebted to him for an honorary degree and speaking opportunity he had provided to him years ago. So when Wilson was contacted by Dixon requesting a screening of the film, he obliged, but apparently didn't know much else about the film other than it was a history piece about the Civil War and Reconstruction, subjects of great interest to Wilson given his background in American history. Now, despite this, The Birth of a Nation was not even treated as the feature presentation of this first ever movie showing at the White House, but rather followed an earlier screening of the Italian film Cabiria, also hailed for its cinematic innovations. The screening certainly did bring more attention to what was already a widely discussed film praised for its use of new technologies and cinema.
It's advertised as The Klansman or The Birth of a Nation. It's got a Klan character on the poster. You're going to argue with me that Wilson had no idea what the movie was about? And secondly, you're president of the United States. Screening a movie at the White House gives a great deal of legitimacy to that film and its topic. You better darn well know what it's about before you go screening it there.
Photography, not to mention being based on an extremely popular novel, though of course it's so much easier to say that it was Wilson's screening that made it popular in the first place. To say that allowing the film to be shown reveals a secret racism of Wilson's or that it promoted a secret agenda is nothing more than looking for patterns where there are none.
At some point, there is a pattern, and that's the point. It's not like you're looking for a pattern where there is none. The pattern is there. It's obvious. It's just one more bit of evidence of that pattern that exists. Look at the man's policies when it came to blacks working in the federal government. Look at the screening. Look at other things, okay? If there's smoke, there's fire.
And views have been further skewed by tabloid allegations printed decades after the original screening and well after Wilson had passed away, claiming that Wilson said, "It is like writing history with lightning, and my only regret is that it is all terribly true." The evidence of Wilson saying this being virtually non-existent, and the probability that he had said it is rather low, given that the portrayal of the Klan in the film deviates from Wilson's own historic writings. Now, to suggest that this showing gave rise or legitimacy to the second Ku Klux Klan is also a far stretch, and once again we find cause not in Wilson but in the progressive society of the day, which popularized the Klansman before it had even become a film. Wilson, an apparently unassuming actor in this timeline of events, should not serve as a scapegoat for the some 4 million who would actually go on to join the organization and give it life.
An unassuming actor in these events. He was just an innocent bystander in all of this happening. Right. By the way, in case you're wondering, in the movie, which the book's actually called The Klansman. Okay, in case you were not sure about what it was about. In the movie, one of the screens shows a quote from Woodrow Wilson. The white men were roused by a mere instinct of self-preservation until at last there had sprung into existence a great Ku Klux Klan, a veritable empire of the South, to protect the Southern country. Woodrow Wilson.
Wilson wasn't in fact racist even for his time, but rather in step with, if not more moderate than the popular beliefs of his day, and to single him out as is so often done is senseless ignorance. Wilson has been accused of recklessly pursuing war despite campaigning on neutrality, acting militantly against US neighbors in Central America and the Caribbean, and ultimately paving the way for modern American interventionism. On local intervention...
Again, not going to give him too much grief over that one. If Theodore Roosevelt had been president, we probably would have done it sooner.
Wilson inherited the border war with Mexico from the Taft administration, not to mention several floating interests and threats that resulted from the Spanish-American War of the McKinley administration and the interventions of the Roosevelt corollary. These lands south of America's border were terribly unstable and dangerous to both American citizens and economic interests within their borders. Thus, American efforts had since been focused on bringing stability and order to these lands on their doorstep. Wilson absolutely
Here's the thing. And again, this is not one of the things I'm going to criticize Woodrow Wilson for, because I do agree other presidents of the time probably would have done similar things. But every time he brings up one of these things that people go after Wilson for, his first instinct is to say why it wasn't Wilson's fault, that it was somebody else's fault, and he was just reacting. As if he just had no choice. You know, here he's saying, well, yeah, Woodrow Wilson might be accused of being interventionist, but he only did it because of these other factors. So he actually was that thing that people accuse him of. You're just saying he had a good reason for it. So it's not both, right? You know, don't say people are accusing him of something he wasn't, but then say the reasons why he was that thing, but it wasn't his fault. Okay? Just say it's not a bad thing, or, you know, that he shouldn't be criticized for it, but don't say it's not true.
Despised what he perceived as the militarism and imperialism brought to America by Roosevelt. Having grown up during the Civil War, Wilson came to view war as senseless destruction that was almost always avoidable, and as such hoped to abandon the military approach to Latin America in favor of arbitration, partnership, and the establishment of a Pan-American League. But these efforts ultimately fell short and proved insufficient to prevent the further destabilization of these countries, forcing continued military action. This kind of interventionism is not unique to Wilson, but part and parcel of the progressive era. But unlike his predecessors, Wilson at least attempted to find an alternative. On the US's entry into the Great War, Wilson from the very beginning sought neutrality and did all he could to maintain it.
He said that. But from the very beginning, only really supported one side. Yes, we were militarily neutral, but we were not economically neutral. It's much like what happened in World War II. No one can argue that Franklin Roosevelt didn't pick sides in World War II long before we entered the war. I'm not saying it's good or bad, and I understand why the United States sides with the Entente in World War I economically. There are a lot of reasons for it, but do not argue to me that he was neutral. No.
But repeatedly the Entente and Central Powers provoked American action. Wilson had for years retained peace through diplomacy, even in the face of blockades, attacks on American vessels, attempts at provoking insurrection and protest within the United States, and attempts at provoking war between the US and its neighbors. Wilson soon realized that despite his best efforts,
it wasn't an attempt to provoke war between the United States and Mexico. It was, if the United States enters the war, then jump in. So, okay, I get it. I get saying it that way, but it wasn't meant to provoke a war between U.S. and Mexico that Germany was outside of. Germany was just asking Mexico to come in on their side if a war happens between Germany and the U.S.
Peace could not be achieved through diplomacy alone. Germany was in fact directly and repeatedly threatening the security of America and its citizens, and thus the country must retaliate. Wilson did in fact run for a second term on the slogan that he, quote, kept us out of war. However, public opinion had quickly shifted in favor of war upon Germany's doubling down on unrestricted submarine warfare and the revelation of the Zimmermann telegram. The war was further framed as a conflict between democracy and tyranny, though this was largely...
I will say this, if your whole campaign is built on he kept us out of war, and your view is neutrality, then what kind of a leader are you that you don't stick to your guns even when public opinion turns against you? If you believe it's the right thing to do it regardless of what people say. You've just been elected to your second term. It's not like they're going to vote you out of office. You just started your second term when all this goes down.
Largely a fanciful interpretation meant to simply bolster American support. Wilson saw the conflict for what it really was, petty squabbling between great powers that grew too big for them to handle, and this understanding is reflected in his attempt to settle disputes as an outside and neutral arbitrator, and provide for the needs of all Europe's distinct people through a redrawing of borders and the establishing of a collaborative League of Nations.
He wanted to take charge of the peace process because he thought he knew better than everybody else how to do it. Woodrow Wilson had a real messiah complex. He could be the savior of the world. He could do what no one else could. And all the way through both terms as president, until he basically wasn't really running the country and his wife was. But anybody in his own cabinet or in his government who disagreed with him, who challenged his views or his policies, was basically looked down on and ostracized as being an idiot who didn't know what he was talking about, who couldn't possibly know and see things the way that the all-wise and powerful Woodrow Wilson did.
Plans which the Germans favored as reasonable and which brought them to the negotiating table, but the victorious European Entente refused to concede their claim of spoils and sought to treat Germany not with reconciliation, but with punishment and suppression. Enough that it might never rise to challenge the likes of France and Britain again. Ironically, it would be these punitive measures by the Entente that ultimately drove Germany down the road to radicalism and drove Europe to the point of a Second Great War. Wilson's decision to enter the war was not unjustified, and it is clear that he had pursued every reasonable alternative up to that point until finally he and a majority of the country determined that enough was enough.
I do agree with the U.S. entering the war. I don't agree that Wilson had done everything he could to stay out of it during his presidency.
Wilson can neither be blamed for the Entente's refusal of his 14 points, nor for Congress's refusal to allow the US to join the League of Nations, nor the chaos which ensued in Europe in later years. In warfare and interventionism, Wilson was an idealist who did what he could to avoid conflict, promote cooperation, and ensure fair play by his idealized vision of American democracy. But reality collided with that idealism and forced him to resort to measures not at all unorthodox or extreme, but perfectly in line with the logic of his predecessors and with the tastes of his day. In conclusion, we find the accusations levied against President Wilson to be great mischaracterizations based on a misunderstanding of his actions and the actions of his predecessors, based in a misunderstanding of politics and culture of the time, and based upon a narrow view of Wilson's administration and his personal character. Once again, I state that I do not personally align myself with the ideology and actions of Woodrow Wilson. However, I acknowledge that there is much confusion and misdirection regarding this historic figure, who by the standards of his day, executed the duties of his office effectively and well enough in line with popular consensus, as well as followed through with the agendas of the progressive movement and the agendas of the presidents who preceded him.
Quick question. If Wilson was no different than the other people of his day when it came to these policies, why is no one going after Theodore Roosevelt for his race relations? Why is no one going after William Howard Taft for how he dealt with some of these issues? Why is no one going after Warren Harding for how he dealt with these issues? Why, in that span of presidents, Calvin Coolidge, William McKinley, why in that span of presidents is it Woodrow Wilson alone, the poor martyr, that we alone attack for these things? Just something to think about.
Having additionally successfully promoted conservation, cracked down on corruption, and promoted labor rights and securities, including working to end child labor. It's clear why Wilson has historically been regarded highly as a president, and only in recent years has that reputation been wrongly warped.
Okay. Well, like I said, I was only responding to the specific things he was talking about. There's a lot of stuff he didn't address conveniently. If you want to hear more about some of the reasons why I love Woodrow Wilson as much as I do, you can check out the video that I did back in April about why he's my favorite president. All tongue-in-cheek, of course. Can't stand the guy. So if you do want one of these shirts, they're available in different colors, and they'll be in the merch store that is in the description of the video, so check that out. Thanks for watching. We'll see you again soon.